When Madeline arrived for the interview, she spotted a photo of her mother in a black frame on the desk of the Millionaire'S office. What she said next left him speechless. Madeline's alarm blared relentlessly, dragging her from a fitful sleep. She squinted at the clock on her nightstand and sighed deeply. Another early morning. Another long day ahead. As she stumbled out of bed, she noticed her grandmother's door slightly ajar. Through the crack she could see the slow rise and fall of her grandmother's frail chest. The steady rhythm of her breathing provided Madeline with a small sense of peace. No matter how tough things got, there was comfort in knowing her grandmother was still here. Still fighting. After quickly dressing in a simple blouse and slacks, Madeline crept into the kitchen. The coffee machine sputtered as it brewed, filling the small apartment with a soothing aroma that calmed her nerves. Today was important. She had an interview at Whitman Enterprises, one of the city's most prestigious companies. A place she had applied to on a whim, never expecting to hear back. But when the call came, her heart nearly stopped. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about how much this opportunity could change everything. Money had always been tight, especially with her grandmother's growing medical bills. Since her mother's death when Madeline was a child, her grandmother had been her only family. The thought of being able to give her grandmother better care filled Madeline with hope. She glanced at the photograph on the fridge, a faded image of her mother, smiling brightly while holding a young Madeline in her arms. "I hope you're watching over me today, Mom," she whispered. "I could really use a bit of your luck." The ride to Whitman Enterprises was nerve-wracking. Madeline had never been in this part of town, where skyscrapers seemed to touch the sky and luxury cars lined the streets. As she walked through the towering glass doors, she felt herself shrink under the weight of the place. Clutching her resume, she stepped into the vast lobby with marble floors that seemed endless and windows that bathed the room in morning light. Everything about the building screamed success, and Madeline felt like she didn't belong. She was directed to the elevator, where a receptionist handed her a visitor's badge. Her heart raced as the elevator ascended to the 20th floor. All the while, she rehearsed her responses to potential questions, but the words felt hollow. What if they saw through her? The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Madeline stepped into an elegantly furnished office space. A receptionist greeted her with a warm smile and asked her to wait. Madeline sat down, her hands nervously fidgeting in her lap, trying to take in her surroundings. The office exuded understated wealth and power. Her gaze landed on a large mahogany desk at the far end of the room. That's when she saw it. A sleek black-framed photo resting on the desk. Madeline froze. The woman in the picture it couldn't be. Her heart skipped a beat as recognition struck her like lightning. It was her mother. Even after all these years, Madeline would know that smile anywhere. She felt weak in the knees and for a moment, she considered running, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Why would Henry Whitman, a man she'd never met, have a photo of her mother on his desk? Just as she tried to process this, a door behind the desk opened and a man stepped out. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and an aura of authority, Madeline recognized him immediately. Henry Whitman, CEO of Whitman Enterprises. "Madeline, right?" he said, extending his hand as he approached. "Thanks for coming in today." Madeline quickly stood, still reeling from the sight of the photo. She shook his hand, trying to hide how clammy her palms had become. "Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Whitman. Please call me Henry," he said with a polite smile. "Let's get started, shall we?" He gestured for her to sit. Madeline's eyes flicked back to the photograph on his desk. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, but she knew she had to focus. This was an interview. She had to get through it. Henry began with the standard questions: background, experience, skills. Madeline answered as best she could, trying to keep her voice steady, but she noticed he seemed distracted. Then, without warning, he changed the subject. "Madeline, I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you grow up?" The question caught her off guard. "Mostly with my grandmother," she replied. "My mother passed away when I was a child." Henry's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. And your father?" "I never knew him," Madeline whispered. "My mother never talked about him." Henry was silent for a moment, his gaze unreadable. "I see," he said finally. "There's something I need to tell you, but I'm not sure how to say it." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of his words, but she didn't interrupt. Henry took a deep breath, clearly gathering his thoughts. That photograph on my desk. The woman in it was someone I loved deeply. A long time ago. Madeline felt the ground shift beneath her. Her mother loved by this man? It didn't make sense. That's my mother, she said, barely above a whisper. She died 20 years ago. Henry's eyes widened, and he leaned back in his chair, stunned. The room was silent, then he whispered, I think we need to have a different kind of conversation, Madeline. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Madeline felt herself drowning in confusion. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of everything. How could Henry Whitman have known her mother? Why would he have her picture on his desk? She wanted to ask so many questions, but the words wouldn't come. Henry sat back, watching her closely, his gaze never leaving her face. It was as though he had seen a ghost. I know this must be overwhelming for you, Henry said softly. Believe me, it's just as shocking for me. But I owe you an explanation. I owe you the truth. Madeline's emotions surged. Fear, curiosity, and a flicker of hope. She nodded, trying to steady herself, but she could feel her hands trembling. Please tell me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry took a deep breath, his expression softening as he began. Your mother. Her name was Amelia, wasn't it? Madeline nodded, and Henry continued, his voice thick with emotion. Amelia and I met more than 20 years ago. She was one of the kindest, most beautiful people I've ever known. We were very much in love. Madeline's breath caught in her throat as her mind raced. She had always known her mother to be gentle and loving, a woman who worked tirelessly to care for her. But she had never mentioned anything about a relationship like this, certainly not one as significant as this. I don't understand, she said, shaking her head. If you knew my mother, why? Why didn't she ever mention you? Henry's face tightened, and he seemed to struggle with the words. Because we were forced apart, he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't by choice. Circumstances. Certain people made sure we couldn't be together. Madeline felt a pang in her chest as she saw the raw pain in his eyes. This wasn't just some old love story. There was something much deeper at play here. But how? She asked, leaning forward. What happened? Henry paused, as if unsure how much he should reveal. We had plans, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. We wanted to build a life together. But then everything fell apart. One day I got a letter supposedly from her. It said she was leaving me, that she didn't love me anymore, and that I should never try to find her. Madeline's eyes widened. That doesn't sound like my mother at all. She would never do that. I know, Henry replied, nodding. I never believed it, but I was young and devastated. I thought maybe I had done something to push her away. It wasn't until much later that I found out the letter was a forgery. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. Fake? Yes, Henry said, his jaw clenching. I thought it was one of my business rivals, someone who didn't want me distracted by love when there was work to be done. But now I'm not so sure. Madeline's mind reeled. It felt like the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed were slowly coming together. But the full picture was still a blur. You said you thought it was a rival, she said carefully. But now you're not sure? Henry nodded, his expression somber. Over the years I tried to move on, but I could never let go of her. When I heard she passed away, it felt like my heart broke all over again. I thought I'd never get the chance to know what really happened. Until today. Madeline's eyes met his. And there in his gaze she saw something unexpected. Vulnerability. This man, so powerful and in control, was now revealing a part of himself he clearly kept hidden for years. Why do you have her picture on your desk? She asked softly. Why now, after all this time? Henry's gaze dropped to the photo, and he reached out, running his fingers gently along the frame. Because I've been trying to find closure, he said quietly. I've kept it there for years as a reminder of what I lost. But seeing you today, it feels like she's come back to me, like a part of her is still here. Madeline didn't know what to say. She had come for a job interview, and now she was sitting across from a man who had clearly been in love with her mother. A man who might hold the key to a past she had never fully understood. You said circumstances kept you apart, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What circumstances? Henry hesitated, his expression darkening a little. There were forces at play, he said carefully. People who made sure Amelia and I would never be together. I had my suspicions back then, but I could never prove anything. Now I think I was right. Madeline's heart raced. This wasn't just a lost love story. It was starting to sound like a conspiracy. What do you mean? She asked, leaning in. Are you saying someone kept you apart on purpose? Henry nodded slowly. Yes, I believe someone manipulated us. They forced her away from me and covered their tracks. I've spent years trying to figure out who it could have been, but every time I got close, something would happen to throw me off. And then I heard about the accident, he added. Madeline froze. The accident? The car crash. That took your mother's life. You think the accident wasn't? Madeline's voice trailed off, disbelief flooding her. Henry met her gaze, his eyes heavy with meaning. I don't think it was an accident, he said quietly. I think it was planned. Madeline's world tilted. She had always believed her mother's death was a tragic, random event. The idea that it could have been orchestrated, deliberately caused, was almost too much to process. Why would anyone? She began, but her voice faltered. I don't know, Henry said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I intend to find out. And now that I know you're her daughter, that you're my daughter, I owe it to both of you to get to the truth. Madeline's mind was spinning. Your daughter. The words felt strange on her tongue. You think I'm your daughter? I know it, Henry said gently, his eyes searching hers. It all makes sense now. The timing. The way you look. You have her eyes, Madeline. I see so much of her in you. I never had any children. And now I understand why. Because she was carrying you when we were torn apart. Madeline's head was spinning with confusion, fear, disbelief. And yet, an unfamiliar sense of belonging. This is all too much, she said, struggling to catch her breath. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Henry said gently. I know this is overwhelming and I don't expect you to process it all at once. But I want to help you. I want to find out what really happened to your mother. I couldn't do it back then, but maybe we can do it together now. Madeline felt a tear slip down her cheek and quickly wiped it away. She didn't know whether to be angry, relieved, or terrified. But one thing was certain. She wanted answers. I want to know the truth, she said, her voice trembling but firm. If someone did this to my mother, I want to know who. And I want to make sure they pay for it. Henry nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. Then we'll do it together, no matter what it takes. Madeline left Whitman Enterprises that day, her head spinning, her heart racing, and a strange new purpose taking root deep inside her. The world outside seemed unchanged. The city streets bustled with activity, the hum of traffic a constant backdrop to the rhythm of daily life. The sun still cast its warm glow over the buildings, and people went about their business, unaware of the storm that had just erupted in Madeline's life. But inside, everything had shifted. She had entered Henry Whitman's office that morning expecting nothing more than a job interview, and now she walked away with a possible father, a mystery to unravel, and a flood of emotion she was only beginning to understand. The bus ride back to her apartment was a blur. Her mind raced with everything Henry had said. Could it be true? The idea that this powerful, successful man was her father felt surreal. Like a plot twist in a movie she'd seen 1,000 times but never imagined she would be living. How could this be possible? How could everything she thought she knew about her past be wrong? When she finally stepped off the bus and arrived at her apartment, the comforting scent of her grandmother's home-cooked stew wafted from the kitchen, grounding her in a moment of normalcy. Her grandmother, a small, frail woman with a soft smile and a quiet strength, was stirring a pot on the stove. "You're back, dear," her grandmother said, turning to face Madeline. "How was the interview?" Madeline hesitated, unsure how to even begin explaining the whirlwind of revelations that had just shaken her world. "It was different," she said, setting her bag down on the counter. "Grandma, can we talk?" Madeline's voice was unsteady, her heart racing as she wondered how to broach the subject that had turned her world upside down. Her grandmother's smile faded as she sensed the gravity of the moment. She turned off the stove and gestured toward the small kitchen table. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Madeline took a deep breath. This was harder than she thought. "I met a man today," she began, her voice trembling. "His name is Henry Whitman." He knew Mom. He says he was in love with her, and that they were separated before I was born. Her grandmother froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the spoon, her eyes widening. Henry Whitman? She repeated as though testing the name. I remember hearing that name once a long time ago. Your mother mentioned it, but she never said much. Madeline leaned forward, her heart pounding. What did she say? Her grandmother's eyes grew distant, lost in the depths of a memory long buried. She was sad, she said softly. She said he was a good man, but that things didn't work out. She never wanted to talk about it again after that. Madeline's heart clenched. She could feel a surge of emotion rising in her chest, a mixture of confusion and a deep, aching longing for answers. Grandma, Henry. He thinks he's my father. The room went silent. The air between them seemed to freeze, and Madeline's words hung in the space like fragile glass, waiting to shatter. Her grandmother's face softened, and she reached out to gently take Madeline's hand in hers. Oh, sweetie. I always wondered, she whispered. Your mother never told me the whole story, but I had my suspicions. She was so secretive about that part of her life, and I never understood why. I wish I had pushed her more to tell me. Tears prickled at the corners of Madeline's eyes, and she squeezed her grandmother's hand. It's not your fault, Grandma, but I need to know the truth. Henry said that someone sent him a fake letter pretending to be Mom. He thinks someone wanted to keep them apart. Her grandmother's expression darkened, a shadow crossing her usually kind face. That poor girl, she murmured almost to herself. She always seemed like she was carrying a heavy burden. I tried to get her to open up, but she just smiled and said everything would be fine. I never imagined. Madeline's voice caught in her throat. I'm so sorry, Grandma, but if there's even a chance that someone did this to her, if it wasn't an accident, I need to know. Her grandmother's eyes widened in shock. But that's impossible, isn't it? How could anyone? Her words faltered, the idea too monstrous to grasp. Madeline shook her head, her resolve hardening. I don't know, she said quietly. But if there's any chance it's true, I need to find out. I need to know why she never got to tell me who my father was. I can't keep living with these unanswered questions. Her grandmother's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. Just be careful, dear, she warned. Digging into the past can be dangerous. Sometimes there are things people don't want to be found. Madeline nodded, understanding the warning, but feeling an unshakable certainty in her heart. I will, Grandma, but I have to do this. The next morning she stood outside Whitman Enterprises, her mind still buzzing with everything she had learned the day before. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts running in circles, but the sense of purpose that had settled over her the night before was still there. Today, she wasn't the nervous young woman who had walked in for a job interview. Today, she was someone searching for answers, answers that could change everything. When she entered Henry's office, he was already waiting for her. The usual confidence he exuded was tempered with something more somber today. His expression was serious, as if he had been preparing himself for whatever was about to unfold. Madeline, he said, standing up as she entered, offering a tentative smile. I'm glad you came back. I know this must be overwhelming, he added, his voice gentle but firm. Madeline nodded, but her gaze didn't soften. She needed answers. She needed him to be completely honest with her. I have questions, she said, sitting down across from him. And I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest. Of course, Henry said immediately, his expression sincere. Ask me anything. Madeline took a steadying breath, gathering her thoughts. This was the moment. You said someone sent you a fake letter pretending to be from my mom. Do you have any idea who could have done that? Henry hesitated. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the weight of everything he had carried for years. I have my suspicions, he said finally. At the time I thought it was a business rival. Someone who didn't want me distracted by love. But after seeing you and realizing everything I didn't know, I'm not so sure anymore. Madeline's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Henry leaned forward, his voice growing more serious. I mean, there are too many coincidences. Your mother's sudden departure, the letter, and then the accident. It's all too convenient. I've spent years trying to put the pieces together, But every lead I followed seemed to hit a dead end. I thought I was being paranoid, but now I'm starting to think I wasn't looking in the right place. Madeline felt a chill creep down her spine. What are you saying? Henry's eyes met hers with quiet intensity. I'm saying that whoever wanted to keep us apart didn't just want to ruin my life. They wanted to erase any possibility of us reconnecting. And if they were willing to go that far— He paused, his voice hardening. I fear they may have had a hand in what happened to your mother. Madeline's hands clenched into fists, a surge of anger flooding her chest. Then we need to find out who it was. I can't just sit back and do nothing. Henry nodded, his gaze steady. I agree. But we have to be careful. Whoever did this was willing to go to great lengths to cover their tracks. And if they realize we're digging, they won't be happy about it. Madeline swallowed hard, but she nodded. I understand. But I'm not afraid. If someone did this to her, if they hurt my mother, I want them to pay. Henry smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. You're so much like her, he said softly. She was always so brave, even when things were tough. Madeline felt a lump rise in her throat. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was getting closer to knowing the woman her mother had been, and the secret she had carried with her. She had always heard tales of her mother's kindness and resilience, but hearing it from someone who had actually loved her made it all feel so much more real, and painfully so. It was one thing to hear about it, but another to feel the weight of it coming from someone who had truly known her. What do we do next? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, barely holding steady. We start by retracing her last days, Henry replied, his tone shifting to one of quiet professionalism. We need to see if there's anything we missed back then, anything that doesn't quite add up. A clue, a detail that didn't make sense. He paused for a moment, then added, I've kept all the old files and notes from the investigation. I'll go over them with you. Maybe there's something we overlooked. Madeline gave a small nod, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for his willingness to let her in on the process. Okay, she said softly, let's do it. As they began discussing their next steps, Madeline couldn't help but feel a strange bond forming between them. It still felt surreal to think of him as her father, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe it, that wanted to find some kind of connection to her past. A past that felt lost but maybe, just maybe, could still be uncovered. When she left his office that evening, one thought kept reverberating in her mind. If someone had gone to such extreme lengths to keep them apart, there must have been a reason. And whatever that reason was, she was determined to find out, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a blur as Madeline and Henry dove headfirst into the investigation. Henry gave her a mountain of documents, old letters, newspaper clippings, and case files. Each night after work, Madeline would sit down with the papers, sifting through them carefully, hoping to find something, anything that might bring her closer to the truth. It was a daunting task. At times she felt like she was drowning in a sea of dead ends and incomplete stories. But Henry's unwavering determination kept her pushing forward. One evening, while they were deep in the middle of their work, surrounded by piles of papers in Henry's office, Madeline's eyes fell on a photograph of her mother. It was a beautiful image, taken in what looked like a sunlit garden, her mother beaming at the camera, a radiant smile on her face. The photo tugged at Madeline's heart, filling her with a bittersweet mix of sadness and longing. When was this taken? She asked quietly, almost to herself. Henry looked up from the file he was studying, following her gaze to the photo. That was the last day we were together, he said softly. We spent the day at a park just outside the city. I remember thinking it was one of the happiest days of my life. His voice trailed off as he grew quiet. I had no idea it would be one of the last. Madeline's chest tightened. She looked so happy, she said, her words barely audible. Henry nodded slowly. She was, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. At least I thought she was. But then she disappeared and everything changed. Madeline didn't know how to respond. She had so many questions about her mother, things she'd never had answers to, and now even more questions seemed to be cropping up. But there was also a strange sense of comfort in knowing that Henry had loved her mother as much as she had. We'll find out what happened, Madeline said, more for her own reassurance than anything else. We have to. Henry gave a resolute nod. I believe we will. But it won't be easy. There are people who went to great lengths to bury the truth, and they won't let it surface without a fight. As the evening wore on, they continued to sift through documents, but progress felt painfully slow. Madeline could sense the frustration growing inside her, and she was just about to suggest they call it a night when something caught her eye. One of the letters Henry had received, purportedly from her mother, was dated only a week before her death. The handwriting was neat, but there was something off about it. "Henry, look at this," Madeline said, handing him the letter. "Do you notice anything strange?" Henry took the letter, his brow furrowing as he studied it. "It's her handwriting," he said, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Madeline pointed to the signature at the bottom. "It doesn't match," she said firmly. "I remember how she used to sign her name on my school forms. And this? It's similar, but it's not quite the same." Henry's eyes widened as he examined the signature more closely. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "I can't believe I didn't catch this earlier." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. "Do you think it was forged?" she asked, her voice tense with a mix of fear and growing suspicion. "It's possible," Henry said, his mind already spinning with theories. "If that's the case, it means someone was trying to manipulate her actions, right up until the very end." Madeline's stomach twisted with a sickening mix of anger and fear. "Do you think this has something to do with the accident?" Henry's face darkened, and though he didn't answer right away, his expression said everything. "I don't know," he replied at last. "But it's starting to feel like everything is connected." "We need to follow this lead," Madeline said, her voice firm. "We need to see where it takes us in the next few days." The investigation grew more intense as they focused on the days leading up to her mother's death. They pored over old records, searching for anyone who might have had a reason to forge that letter or manipulate her life in some way. The deeper they dug, the more questions seemed to emerge. One evening, after another grueling day of searching, Henry decided to take Madeline somewhere important. "I want to show you something," he said as they left the office. "It might help you understand why this is so important to me." They drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The house they stopped in front of was small, weathered, and charming in its own way. The garden had grown wild, and the shutters were chipped and peeling, but there was a warmth to the place, even in its disrepair. "This is where we were going to live," Henry said, his voice soft as they stepped out of the car. "Your mother and I bought it together. We had plans to fix it up, make it our home." Madeline's heart ached as she looked at the house. She could almost imagine her mother there, tending to the garden or sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, smiling the way she always had. "I had no idea," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Henry's eyes grew distant as he continued. "I never got to move in," he said quietly. "After she left, I couldn't bring myself to come back here. But I kept the house. It was all I had left of her." A lump formed in Madeline's throat. "I thought maybe one day I'd understand why she left," he added. "And now I finally have a chance to find out." Madeline wiped at her eyes, trying to steady her emotions. "Thank you for showing me this," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "It means a lot." Henry gave a small nod, and for a moment, the two of them stood in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. After a beat, Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a small weathered key. "There's one more thing," he said, handing it to her. "This is the key to the house. If you ever need a place to think or just want to be closer to her, it's yours." Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she took the key. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice breaking. Henry smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything. I'm just glad you're here. And I promise we'll get to the bottom of this, whatever it takes." The next morning, Henry received a call that would change everything. One of his old contacts, a private investigator he had hired years ago, had found something. "Henry, I'm not sure what to make of this," the voice on the other end said, "but I think you should see it for yourself." The investigator's voice crackled through the phone. "I dug up some old records and there's a name that keeps coming up. Someone who had ties to Amelia's life around the time of her death." Henry's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Malcolm Warren," the investigator replied. "He was a business associate of yours, wasn't he?" Henry's stomach sank. Malcolm Warren wasn't just a business associate. He had been a close friend. Someone Henry had trusted completely. "Yes," Henry answered, his voice steady despite the churn in his chest. "He was. What does he have to do with this?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," the investigator admitted. But there are some unusual financial transactions between him and a few other people around the time of Amelia's death. It looks like someone was being paid to keep quiet about something. Henry's mind raced. Could Malcolm have been involved in the conspiracy that had torn him and Amelia apart? It was a possibility he hadn't even considered, but now the pieces were starting to fall into place. "Thank you," he said, his voice low with a mix of gratitude and urgency. "Keep digging. I need to know everything." After hanging up, Henry turned to Madeline, who had been listening closely. "We might have a lead," he said, his tone thick with tension. "But if Malcolm's involved, things are about to get a lot more complicated." Madeline could see the storm in his eyes, but she felt a surge of determination in her chest. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "Whatever it takes." Henry nodded, though there was a sadness in his gaze. "You remind me so much of her," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Your strength. Your courage. She'd be so proud of you." Madeline's heart swelled at his words, but she pushed the emotion aside. There would be time for that later. For now there was a new lead to follow, and she was more determined than ever to find the truth, even if it meant facing the man who had once been a trusted friend of her newly discovered father. The next few days felt like a blur. Madeline and Henry worked relentlessly, preparing to confront the possibility that Malcolm Warren, someone Henry had once trusted, might be tied to the conspiracy that led to Amelia's death. The idea was almost too painful for Henry to accept, but he knew they had no choice but to pursue this lead. Henry arranged a meeting with Malcolm at an upscale cafe on the outskirts of town, a place where they used to meet for business lunches. But this time the air felt different. The usual casual atmosphere was replaced by an undercurrent of tension. As they pulled into the parking lot, Henry glanced at Madeline, who was sitting beside him, her expression a mixture of determination and anxiety. "You don't have to be here for this," he said gently, though he knew it was a useless attempt to convince her. "I can handle Malcolm on my own." Madeline shook her head without hesitation. "I want to be here," she said firmly. "I need to see this through." Henry felt a surge of pride, even as his heart tightened with the weight of the situation. "All right," he said softly, "let's go." They stepped out of the car and walked into the cafe, where Malcolm was already waiting at a table by the window. As soon as he saw them, he stood up, flashing a wide, welcoming smile. "Henry, it's been too long," he said, extending his hand. "And this must be Madeline. I've heard a lot about you." Madeline shook his hand, her eyes scanning his face for any hint of deception. "Nice to meet you," she said, her tone polite but cautious. Henry forced a smile, though his mind was racing with a million thoughts. "Yes, it has been a while, Malcolm," he said as he sat down. "I'm glad you could make time to meet with us." Of course," Malcolm replied, still smiling as he took his seat. "What's on your mind?" Henry took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago," he said, locking eyes with Malcolm. "Something that involves Amelia." For a brief moment, Malcolm's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Amelia?" he said, feigning confusion. "I'm not sure I understand." "I think you do," Henry said, his voice calm but laced with an edge. "I know about the letters, those ones supposedly from her, telling me to stay away. And I know that someone was paying people to keep quiet about what happened around the time of her death. I need to know if you had anything to do with it." Madeline could see a flicker of something in Malcolm's eyes, maybe surprise, maybe fear. But then he laughed. It was a hollow sound, forced. "Henry, that was years ago," he said, shaking his head. "Why are we bringing this up now? Whatever happened back then, it's in the past." "Because it's not just the past," Henry shot back, his voice growing sharper. "It's about my daughter's mother. It's about the fact that I was lied to, manipulated, and kept away from the woman I loved. So I'm going to ask you one more time, did you have anything to do with it?" The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken accusations. For a moment it seemed like Malcolm would deny everything. But then he sighed, and the smile faded from his face. "Henry, you don't want to go down this road," he said quietly. "Sometimes the truth isn't worth the trouble it brings." Madeline's anger flared. "What do you mean by that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "If you know something, you need to tell us." Malcolm looked at her, and for a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Madeline," he said softly. But there are things you don't understand. Things that can't be undone. Henry's patience finally snapped. Enough with the vague answers, Malcolm, he said, his voice rising. I trusted you. If you had anything to do with what happened to Amelia, I deserve to know. Malcolm sighed again, slumping in his chair. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll tell you, but you're not going to like it. What followed was a slow, painful confession. Malcolm explained how years ago he'd been approached by another business associate, someone connected to Henry's rivals. This person had made him an offer. If Malcolm helped drive a wedge between Henry and Amelia, he would be rewarded with a lucrative business opportunity. At the time, Malcolm hadn't thought much of it. He saw it as a way to secure his future, never fully grasping the consequences of his actions. The letter wasn't my idea, Malcolm said, his voice hollow. But I delivered it. I made sure it got to you, Henry. I didn't know what they were going to do. I didn't know it would lead to what happened. Madeline felt a sharp, painful twist in her chest. You're saying you helped them separate my parents? She asked, her voice faltering. And you never thought to tell anyone? I thought it was just business, Malcolm said, almost defensively. I didn't know it would end like this. I was young, stupid, and greedy. I made a mistake and I've had to live with it ever since. Henry's fists clenched, barely keeping his rage in check. Do you know who was behind it? He asked, his voice trembling with fury. Who orchestrated the whole thing? Malcolm hesitated, glancing nervously around the cafe before finally speaking. I don't know his real name, he said, his voice strained. I only knew him by his alias, Gray. He was connected, powerful, the kind of man you don't cross if you want to stay alive. Malcolm's voice shook as he spoke, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. I haven't heard from him in years, but if he's still involved, be careful. Madeline exchanged a glance with Henry. This was the first time they'd ever heard of anyone referred to as Gray. But it was a lead. A dangerous one, but a lead nonetheless. We need to find out who he is, Madeline said, her voice firm with determination. If he was behind the separation of you and my mother, then he might be the one who had her killed, too. Henry nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Thank you for telling us, Malcolm, he said, though his tone was devoid of warmth. But this isn't over. Malcolm's face tightened, a genuine fear crossing his features. I've told you everything I know, he said, his voice unsteady. But if you're going to dig into this, just be careful. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. If he finds out you're looking for him. His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. He won't hesitate to silence you. That night, Henry and Madeline sat together in his office, surrounded by papers and files that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. They had uncovered a lot, but the more they learned, the darker and more complicated the picture became. The revelation about Malcolm had been painful, but it had also given them a new direction. A name, Gray, even if it was just an alias, was better than nothing. Do you think Malcolm was telling the truth? Madeline asked, her brow furrowed in concern. Or was he just trying to throw us off? Henry leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I believe him, he said, though the weariness in his voice was impossible to ignore. He has nothing to gain by lying at this point. And the fear in his eyes, that was real. Whoever Gray is, he's dangerous, Madeline murmured, a shiver creeping down her spine. Henry nodded, his expression grim. We need to be smart about this. We can't just start asking questions. We need to find out who Gray is without drawing too much attention. Madeline stood up, her resolve hardening. Then we'll have to be discreet. We'll dig quietly, follow the trail without making waves. I'll help however I can. Henry looked at her, his gaze filled with a mix of admiration and concern. I'll reach out to some contacts. There are still people who owe me favors, and I'm sure one of them might have heard of this Gray. He paused before continuing. But you need to promise me something. Madeline raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What is it? Things start to get too dangerous. Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You have to walk away. His eyes were steady, insistent. I don't want you getting hurt because of my past. Madeline shook her head without missing a beat. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. This is my fight too. Whoever did this took my mother away from me, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. Henry's expression softened as he met her gaze. He knew there was no point in arguing with her now. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll do this together. But we have to be careful. Whoever Gray is, he won't let us find him without a fight." As they sat there, planning their next steps, Madeline felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, she was getting closer to the truth about her mother's death, and she had Henry by her side. But as the weight of their mission settled over her, she knew that they were stepping into dangerous territory. There was no telling what they might uncover, or how far Gray would go to protect his secrets. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She had spent her whole life with unanswered questions, and now she was finally getting the chance to find the answers she'd been searching for. And no one was going to stand in her way. Over the following week, Henry and Madeline worked tirelessly, cautiously following leads and reaching out to Henry's old contacts. Each clue they uncovered led them deeper into a labyrinth of dark secrets. But one thing became clear. Whoever Gray was, he had been pulling strings from the shadows for a long time. Henry was careful about who he contacted, knowing that even the slightest hint of what they were investigating could put them in danger. He reached out to former associates, retired business partners, anyone who might have had dealings with powerful figures from the time he and Amelia had been separated. Despite his best efforts, information on Gray remained scarce, almost as if the man had never existed, a ghost with no past to follow. Madeline, meanwhile, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in her life. She still cared for her grandmother, making sure to check in on her every day. But in the hours between visits, she pored over old records and documents, searching for any shred of information that might help. The exhaustion was wearing on her, but she couldn't stop now. Not when they were finally making progress. Then one afternoon, just as she was about to head to Henry's office, her phone rang. "Madeline," Henry's voice crackled through the line, urgent and tight with excitement. "I need you to come to my office right now. I think we've got something." Her heart leaped in her chest. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her bag and rushing out the door. When she arrived, Henry was pacing in his office, a mixture of excitement and anxiety painted across his face. "What happened?" Madeline asked, breathless from running up the stairs. Henry stopped pacing, his eyes wide with intensity. "I got a call from one of my contacts. Someone who used to work in security for one of my old rivals. He heard about our inquiries and reached out to me." Madeline's pulse quickened. "What did he say?" Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. "He said that Gray was a code name used by a man who worked as a fixer. Someone who handled problems for powerful people, usually behind the scenes. But here's the kicker. Gray wasn't just any fixer." Henry's face tightened with gravity. "He was known for making problems disappear. Permanently." A chill ran down Madeline's spine. "You mean, like arranging accidents?" Henry nodded grimly. "Exactly. And it gets worse. My contact said that Gray's clients weren't just businessmen. He had connections to law enforcement, politics, even the media. That's why it's so hard to track him down. He had people in high places protecting him." Madeline felt a knot form in her stomach. "Do you think he was the one behind my mother's accident?" Henry's voice tightened with barely suppressed anger. "Starting to look that way. But there's something else," he added, his tone darkening. "My contact mentioned that Gray operates out of a private club downtown. Place few people know about. It's a place where the city's elite go to conduct business away from prying eyes," Henry said, his voice low with urgency. "If we want to find out more about Gray, that's where we need to start." Madeline's heart raced, a mix of fear and determination gripping her. "Then that's where we'll go," she said, her voice steady. "We have to find him." Henry hesitated, looking at her with a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's dangerous, Madeline. If we're right, and this man was involved in what happened to Amelia, he won't think twice about hurting anyone who gets too close to the truth. We're walking into the lion's den." "I know," Madeline replied, her gaze unwavering. "But I'm not backing down. Not now." Henry exhaled sharply, his concern evident. "All right. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just walk in and start asking questions. We need a plan." Later that evening, they sat together in Henry's office, poring over their next move. Henry explained that the club was members only, and without an invitation, they'd have no chance of getting in. Fortunately, one of Henry's old acquaintances, a man named Victor, was a member. Henry called him and arranged to meet, hoping to secure their entry without raising suspicion. The next day they met Victor at a quiet bar across town. He was tall, imposing, with a neatly trimmed beard and a sharp suit that spoke of wealth and power. When he saw Madeline, his eyes flickered with curiosity, but he greeted Henry warmly. "So this is the young lady you mentioned," Victor said, extending his hand to Madeline. "I'm Victor." "Nice to meet you," Madeline said, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you for agreeing to help us." Victor smiled, though his expression held an undercurrent of caution. "I'm not sure I'd call it helping just yet," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "Henry told me you're looking for someone who goes by the name Gray. That's a dangerous game you're playing. People who ask too many questions about Gray don't usually stick around for long." "We understand the risks," Henry said, his tone firm. "But we need to know if you can get us into the club. We might be able to find someone who knows something." Victor sighed, his expression weighing the decision. "I can get you in," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "But you need to be careful. Don't draw attention to yourselves. And whatever you do, don't mention Gray's name directly. If he's still around, there's a good chance he has eyes and ears in that place." Henry nodded. "Understood. We'll be discreet." Victor finished his drink and set the glass down with a deliberate clink. "I'll make the arrangements. You'll be my guests. But after that, you're on your own. I can't promise to keep you safe if things go south." The club was exactly as Madeline had imagined. A dark, opulent place where the city's most powerful people gathered, far from the eyes of the public. Dark wood paneling, leather armchairs, and a polished bar gleaming under the dim, ambient lighting. It was the kind of place where deals were made that would never see the light of day. Victor led them inside, giving a curt nod to the bouncer at the door. "Try to blend in," he murmured as they walked through the main hall. "You're just here for drinks. Nothing more." They settled into a corner booth, their eyes scanning the room. Madeline's stomach churned with anxiety. Every face around her seemed composed, almost indifferent. But she knew that behind those calm expressions were people who could destroy lives with a single word. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them had known her mother, how many had played a part in the events that had led to her death. As they sipped their drinks, a man approached their table. He was tall and thin, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Henry Whitman," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "It's been a while." Henry looked up, his expression guarded. "James." The man glanced at Madeline, his smile widening. "And who is this lovely young lady?" "This is my daughter, Madeline," Henry replied, his tone even but clipped. "She's here with me tonight." James raised an eyebrow in surprise. "I didn't know you had a daughter, Henry," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of curiosity. "Then again, there are a lot of things I don't know about you, aren't there?" Madeline's heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling about the way James looked at her, as though he was trying to figure out her every thought. "Nice to meet you," she said, forcing a polite smile. "The pleasure's mine," James said, though his eyes never left hers. "You know, Henry, it's been a while since I've seen you around these parts. What brings you back?" "Just catching up with old friends," Henry replied smoothly, his voice casual. "It's always nice to reconnect." James's smile remained, but a glint of suspicion flickered in his eyes. "Well, I hope you enjoy your evening," he said, finally turning to leave. "And if you're looking for anything specific, just let me know. I can always point you in the right direction." As soon as he was out of earshot, Madeline leaned in closer to Henry. "Who was that?" "James is someone who knows things," Henry said, his voice low. "If anyone here knows something about Gray, it's him. But we need to be careful. He's the type to sell you out if it benefits him." Madeline's mind spun. "Do you think he suspects something?" "I don't know," Henry said, his eyes scanning the room. "But we need to find out what he knows, and if he really can point us in the right direction." Madeline couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The faces around them were unreadable, their conversations hushed and controlled. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of what they were up against. Gray wasn't just a person. He was a shadow that hung over everything. an invisible hand that could crush them with a single misstep. But Madeline wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever secrets this place held, she was going to uncover them. And she would make sure the truth about her mother finally came to light. The following morning, Henry and Madeline left the club, their heads swirling with questions. Their brief interaction with James had only deepened the mystery. But one thing was clear. If they wanted to learn more about Gray, they would have to play the game. And that meant taking risks. The next day, Henry decided to reach out to James directly. They needed information, and Henry suspected that James, armed with his network of connections, could provide it, but at a cost. "I'll handle this," Henry said, his voice steady as he looked at Madeline across his desk. James respects directness, but he also likes to have the upper hand. If we're going to get anything out of him, we need to approach carefully. Madeline's instincts screamed that this was a mistake, but she trusted Henry's judgment. "Just be careful," she said, her voice tight. "I don't trust him." "I don't either," Henry admitted, his gaze distant as he considered their situation. "But we're running out of options. If we don't get a lead soon, this trail could go cold, and we might never find out who Gray is." Later that afternoon, Henry arranged to meet James at a small, discreet restaurant on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be seen, and James had suggested it himself, which made Henry uneasy. But he had no other choice. When James arrived, he was dressed impeccably as always, casual yet calculated. He slid into the booth across from Henry with an almost predatory air. "I have to say I'm intrigued," James said, his eyes gleaming. "What exactly are you looking for?" Henry leaned back, his expression neutral, and didn't hesitate. "Information," he said simply. "I need to know about Gray, who he is, where he operates, and how I can find him." James chuckled as if Henry had just told him a joke. "Straight to the point. I admire that," he said, his smile turning faintly sardonic. "But you have to understand, information like that doesn't come cheap." "I'm willing to pay," Henry replied, his voice steady. "Name your price." James's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it's not about money, Henry. It's about leverage. You see, people like Gray, they operate in the shadows. And those shadows are protected by very powerful people. If I give you what you're asking for, I'm risking a lot." Henry's jaw tightened. "So tell me, why should I trust you?" James paused for a moment, then leaned in, his voice dropping lower. "Because I'm not just giving you information. You're asking me to help you fight a war with no rules, no morals. If you're willing to step into the ring with Gray, you need to understand. Once you're in, there's no getting out." Henry hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice cold but resolute. "Because this isn't just about business," he said, his eyes fixed on James. "It's personal. I want to know why Amelia was taken from me, and I want to know who was responsible. If Gray was involved, then I'm going to make sure he answers for it." James's eyes darkened slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Amelia," he said, the name hanging in the air like a bitter taste. "Yes, I remember her. Lovely woman. It's a shame what happened to her." Henry's fists clenched under the table. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" he demanded. James didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze unwavering. "You're digging up things that were meant to stay buried, Henry. Gray's been around for a long time, and he's very good at what he does. If you're looking for justice, you're going to be disappointed." "I'm not looking for justice," Henry said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I'm looking for the truth." James sighed, setting his glass down with deliberate slowness. "Very well. I can point you in the right direction. But you need to understand, this will come at a cost." Henry's stomach tightened. "What kind of cost?" "Gray doesn't like to be found," James said, his voice low and serious. "And if he senses you're getting too close, he'll make sure you regret it." Henry's jaw tightened, but his resolve didn't falter. "I'll take my chances. Tell me what you know." James leaned in even closer, lowering his voice further, as though what he was about to say could get him killed. "There's a warehouse in the industrial district," he said quietly. "It's where Gray's people conduct business, things that can't be traced, no loose ends. If you're looking for answers, that's where you'll find them. He paused, giving Henry a hard look. But be warned, if you go there, you're not going to find a welcoming committee. And if Gray gets wind of this, he'll come after you. Henry nodded, his heart pounding, but he said nothing. Thank you, he said finally, his voice controlled. I'll handle the rest. James smiled again, though there was something almost pitying in his eyes. Good luck, Henry. You're going to need it. When Henry relayed the information to Madeline, she immediately voiced her concern. A warehouse, she said, her voice tight with suspicion. This sounds like a trap. It could be, Henry admitted. But we don't have much of a choice. If James is telling the truth, this could be our best shot at finding out more about who Gray really is. Madeline's mind raced. She wanted answers as much as Henry did. But the thought of walking into an unknown situation without a clear plan terrified her. We need backup, she said, her voice firm. We can't just go there without knowing what we're walking into. I agree, Henry said, his eyes narrowing as he looked over his notes. I've already reached out to one of my security contacts. He's discreet and he can give us support from a distance. We'll have eyes on the place before we get anywhere near it. Madeline was relieved, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than they realized. When do we go? She asked. Tomorrow night, Henry said. That's when the activity at the warehouse is usually busiest. We'll blend in with the traffic, get close enough to see what's going on, and then we'll make our move. The next evening, Madeline and Henry found themselves in a dark, deserted alley across from the warehouse. They had arrived separately to avoid drawing attention, but now they were together, waiting for the signal from Henry's contact. The air was cold and Madeline's hand shook slightly as she clutched her phone, trying to stay calm. Are you sure about this? She whispered, her voice filled with doubt. We could still turn back. No, Henry said firmly, his voice resolute. We need to see this through. If Gray was involved in Amelia's death, this might be our only chance to prove it. Madeline nodded, swallowing her fear. Okay, let's do it. A few minutes later, Henry's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his contact. Clear for now. 2 guards at the entrance but no sign of Gray. Looks like we're good to go. Henry showed Madeline the message. Let's move, he said, his voice low. They approached the warehouse cautiously, sticking to the shadows. As they got closer, they could hear voices coming from inside, muffled by the thick walls. The building loomed large and imposing, with a few scattered lights casting eerie shadows on the cracked concrete ground. Henry led the way to a side entrance, where they could slip in unnoticed. The door was unlocked. They pushed it open quietly, slipping inside. The interior of the warehouse was dark, with narrow beams of light cutting through the gloom. Stacks of crates lined the walls, and the air smelled of oil and dust. They moved in silence, every sense on high alert, listening for any signs of movement. As they moved deeper into the building, they could hear faint voices coming from a room at the far end. Henry motioned for Madeline to follow as they crept closer, straining to hear what was being said. The shipment will be ready by next week, a voice said, barely audible. Make sure it gets to the dock without any issues. Understood, another voice replied. And what about the Whitman situation? Should we be concerned? Madeline's heart stopped. They were talking about Henry. Not yet, the first voice said. Gray hasn't given any orders. But if they keep poking around, we'll have to take care of it. Henry's eyes met Madeline's, and she could see the alarm in them. They were being watched, and whoever was behind this was already planning their next move. We need to get out of here, Henry whispered urgently. Now. But just as they turned to leave, they heard the sound of a door opening behind them. They froze, their hearts pounding as footsteps echoed through the warehouse. A tall, shadowy figure stepped into view. Madeline felt a wave of dread wash over her as she recognized him. It was James. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I have to say I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd actually have the guts to show up here. Henry's hands clenched into fists. You set us up. James shrugged, his smile widening. Of course I did. You're not the only one who knows how to play the game, Henry. But don't worry. You're not leaving empty-handed. He took a step closer, his voice turning cold. I have a message for you, from Gray. Before either Henry or Madeline could react, two men stepped out of the shadows behind James, blocking their only escape route. The air seemed to freeze, the weight of the situation sinking in with chilling clarity. "You've been asking too many questions, Henry," James said, his voice suddenly cold and calculated. "Gray doesn't like that." His eyes flicked toward the two men, who stood silently, their hands resting on the grips of concealed weapons. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop digging. You're going to walk away. Because if you don't—" He paused for effect, the threat hanging in the air like a guillotine's blade. "Well, let's just say your little reunion with your daughter won't last much longer." Madeline's blood ran cold at the implication. She saw the seriousness in James's eyes, and every instinct in her screamed that he wasn't bluffing. She felt her throat tighten as she tried to steady herself. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice trembling despite the bravado she tried to project. James laughed softly, the sound devoid of humor. "Maybe not now," he said. "But you will be." With that, he turned on his heel to leave, but not before throwing one last remark over his shoulder. "Consider this your last warning, Henry. If you want to stay alive, you'll keep your nose out of Gray's business. Because the next time we meet, I won't be so generous." Henry and Madeline stood frozen in place, their minds racing. They had come seeking answers, but all they had found was a new layer of threats, and the terrifying knowledge that Gray was watching them. Whoever he was ready to do anything to protect his secrets. Once James and his men had disappeared into the shadows, Henry let out a slow breath, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. They were no longer just hunting a man. They were caught in something far more dangerous, with consequences that reached far beyond their initial investigation. The drive back to Henry's office was silent, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. As they pulled into the parking lot, Henry parked the car with a sharp motion and turned to face Madeline, his expression grim. "We need to stop," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "At least for now." Madeline blinked, shocked. "You're serious?" "Gray has people everywhere," Henry said, his tone heavy. "If we keep pushing, we're going to get hurt. Or worse." Madeline stared at him wide-eyed. "You can't be serious. We're closer than ever. We can't just walk away now. Not after everything." Henry's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I know how you feel," he said, his voice softer. "But I'm not willing to risk your life. James was right about one thing. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. If we keep digging, he'll come after us. And next time he won't miss." Madeline's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. "I'm not afraid of him," she said, her voice resolute despite the tremor in it. "He took everything from us. From you? From me. From my mother. I'm not going to let him get away with it." Henry's heart clenched as he looked at her, a mix of pride and fear flooding him. She had her mother's spirit, unyielding, relentless, and he admired that. But he also knew that kind of strength could be dangerous, especially when up against someone like Gray. "Madeline," he began softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I've already lost one person I loved because of this. I can't lose you too." Madeline's resolve faltered for only a moment. Then, after a long breath, she shook her head, her expression set. "I understand why you're scared," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "But I'm not going to stop. You said you wanted the truth. I do too. If Gray thinks he can scare us into giving up, he's wrong." Henry exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to find closure, trying to make peace with the loss of Amelia. But standing on the edge of a dangerous conspiracy, he realized that peace would never come unless they saw this through. "All right," he said after a long pause. "But we need to be smart about this. If we're going to keep digging, we can't let Gray know we're still looking. We need to move quietly. Carefully." Madeline nodded, relief washing over her. "We can do that," she said, her voice firm. "But we need a new plan. Something that will let us get close to him without drawing attention." The following day, they began to work on their new approach. Henry reached out to a few trusted contacts, specialists in surveillance and discreet investigations. They could help track down any information on Gray, gathering intel without leaving a trail. Meanwhile, Madeline started combing through old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of incidents that mirrored her mother's death. It was tedious, frustrating work, but after several days, Madeline found something. An article about a car crash that had happened 2 years before Amelia's death. The circumstances were eerily similar. A single-car accident on a quiet road late at night, no witnesses. The victim had been a businesswoman embroiled in a legal dispute with a major corporation at the time of her death. Madeline's pulse quickened as she read through the details. There was no direct link to Gray, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her mind raced as she rushed into Henry's office, the article clutched in her hand. "Look at this," she said, her voice urgent. "Doesn't it sound familiar?" Henry scanned the page, his expression darkening as he read. "It does," he said, his voice tight. "Too familiar. If this is connected to Gray, then it means he's been active for a long time." Madeline's mind was already spinning. And if he's willing to eliminate people over business disputes, then there's no telling how far his influence goes. Henry's brow furrowed. "Which means we need to find someone who knows him, someone who's worked with him or seen how he operates. We need to get closer." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. "Do you have anyone in mind?" Henry thought for a moment, his gaze distant. Then his eyes lit up, as though a light bulb had gone off in his head. "James mentioned that Gray has connections in law enforcement, politics, and the media. If we can find someone in those circles who's willing to talk, we might be able to get a lead on him." Madeline's heart thudded in her chest. "Do you trust him?" Henry hesitated. "I don't know. But I've heard of him. His name's Alex Mitchell. He's a journalist, known for investigating corruption. He's been digging into the city's underworld for years. If anyone's heard whispers about Gray, it's him." Madeline's brow furrowed. "And do you trust him?" Henry exhaled, his jaw tightening. "I don't know. But he has a reputation for being persistent, and he's not afraid to make enemies. If he's willing to talk, he could be our best chance." That evening, Henry made the call. To their surprise, Alex agreed to meet them. They arranged to meet at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place where Alex could stay under the radar. When they arrived, Alex was already there, sitting at a booth in the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as they approached, middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a weary expression that spoke of years spent chasing shadows. "Henry Whitman," Alex said, his voice low. "Didn't expect a call from you. What's this about?" Henry sat down beside Madeline, leaning forward slightly. "We need information," he said bluntly, "about a man who goes by the name Gray." Alex's eyebrows lifted, but his expression remained unreadable. "Gray, huh? That's a dangerous name to be throwing around. What makes you think I know anything about him?" "We're not asking for much," Madeline said, her voice steady as she leaned forward. "Just whatever you can tell us. We're trying to figure out who he is and why he's been targeting people." Alex studied them for a long moment, his eyes hard. "People who go looking for Gray don't usually come out of it unscathed," he said, his voice low. "If you're serious about this, you need to understand what you're getting into." "We understand," Henry said, his tone firm. "But we need answers." Alex sighed, as if resigning himself to a decision he didn't want to make. "All right," he said, his voice low. "I've heard of Gray. He's not a name you hear often, but when you do, it's usually in hushed tones. He's not just some enforcer. He's an operator. Someone who makes problems disappear. And he does it in a way that leaves no trace. That's why he's so hard to track." Madeline felt her heart race as Alex's words hit her like a punch. "This is real. This is bigger than we thought. Do you know how we can find him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't," Alex said, shaking his head. "But I've heard rumors about where he operates. There's a private estate on the edge of the city. People go there to conduct business away from prying eyes. It's owned by a shell company, but word is Gray uses it as his base of operations. If you're looking for him, that's your best shot." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Why are you telling us this?" Alex's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "Because I've been trying to get close to Gray for years, and I've never been able to. He's untouchable. But if you're crazy enough to try, I figure I might as well point you in the right direction." He leaned back in the booth, his expression hardening. Just don't expect it to be easy. Gray doesn't take kindly to people poking around his business. Madeline felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered with fear. We're getting closer. But will we make it out alive? Thank you, Alex, she said, her voice sincere. We'll be careful. You'd better be, Alex warned, his eyes dark with concern. Because if Gray finds out you're looking for him, he won't just come after you. He'll make sure you disappear, just like all the others. The private estate was everything they had feared. A sprawling mansion on the edge of town, surrounded by high walls, security cameras, and a sense of isolation that made it feel like a fortress. It was the kind of place where secrets thrived in the dark corners, and no one asked questions. As Henry and Madeline stood at a distance, looking up at the imposing structure, they knew this was their next step, perhaps their only chance to uncover the truth. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their decision sinking in. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. The next few days were spent preparing. Henry arranged for a car and disguises that would help them blend in, while Madeline studied maps and laid out an approach. Every detail had to be perfect, and still they both knew it was a risk. This could go terribly wrong. But they were out of options. If we don't do this now, we may never get another chance. The night of the operation arrived, and the air was thick with tension. They parked the car a short distance from the estate and made their way to a service entrance, where the shadows were deep and the darkness swallowed their footsteps. The night was cool, with heavy clouds blotting out the stars. The estate loomed in front of them, a dark, imposing figure in the distance. Madeline's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She felt the weight of the moment pressing on her. But there was no turning back now. This is it, Henry whispered, his voice low and tense. Are you ready? Madeline swallowed hard, barely able to breathe, but she nodded. Yes. Let's do this. They slipped through the gate and into the shadows, moving quickly but silently. The estate seemed unnaturally quiet. No guards, no dogs, no signs of life except the faint hum of security cameras scanning the perimeter. They crept along the side of the building, scanning the windows for any movement, until they found a side door that led into the mansion. Inside, the hallways were dimly lit, a faint glow coming from distant rooms. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the distant murmur of voices. Are we alone? Or are we being watched? Madeline's nerves were on edge. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. They had to find something, anything that could lead them to Gray. They moved cautiously down the hall, careful not to make a sound, until they came to a door slightly ajar. Henry peeked through the crack. His eyes widened. Madeline, he breathed, his voice low. You need to see this. Inside the room, several men were seated around a table, deep in conversation. But it wasn't the men that caught Henry's attention. It was the stack of files on the table. Each file was labeled with a different name, but one stood out among the rest. Amelia's name was written on it. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat. This is it. This is the proof we need. That's it, she whispered, urgency rising in her chest. We need to get that file. Henry nodded, his gaze locked on the table. But just as he was about to move, the door creaked open. A chill ran down Madeline's spine as she heard footsteps inside. The men turned toward them, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of Henry and Madeline standing in the doorway. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then the lead man, a tall figure with a scar running down the side of his face, stood up. His smile was cold, predatory. Well, well, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Looks like we have some uninvited guests. I wonder how Gray will feel about this. Madeline's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. We're not leaving without those files, she said, her voice shaky but defiant. The scarred man's smile widened, and he took a step forward, his eyes glinting with menace. I don't think you understand the situation, sweetheart, he said, his voice low and threatening. You're not leaving at all. As the men closed in, Henry and Madeline realized they were trapped. They had come searching for answers, but now they were about to face the deadly consequences of getting too close to the truth. The shadows of the estate seemed to close in around them, and somewhere in the dark heart of the mansion, Gray was waiting, watching, ready to make his move. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Madeline's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. They were surrounded. The men's smug expressions and the predatory gleam in their eyes made it clear that they wouldn't leave without a fight, or worse. Henry stepped in front of Madeline protectively, his fists clenched. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his voice low but filled with barely controlled fury. "We're only here for the truth." The scarred man chuckled darkly. "The truth?" he sneered. "You're in the wrong place for that, old man. No one here is interested in the truth. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. And you're looking like a pretty big one right now." Henry knew there was no reasoning with them. They were Gray's people, ruthless, loyal, and merciless. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate them. "Let us walk out of here," Henry said, his voice steady but intense, "and we won't come back." The scarred man's smile faded, replaced by cold, calculating eyes. He nodded, and without another word, the men began to close in. Madeline's stomach twisted with fear, her pulse pounding in her ears. "This is it. This is where we die." But then, without thinking, she grabbed Henry's arm and yanked him back. "We have to run," she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. Henry didn't hesitate. Grabbing her hand, he bolted for the door behind them. The men shouted in surprise, but they were too slow to react. They sprinted down the narrow hallway, desperate to escape. The sound of footsteps pounded behind them, and Madeline's heart raced as she struggled to keep up with Henry's long strides. The mansion was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, and they had no idea where they were going. "Where's the exit?" Madeline gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "I don't know," Henry hissed through gritted teeth. "We just have to keep moving." The voices behind them grew louder, closer. The walls seemed to close in, the mansion turning into a maze of shadows and death. As they turned a corner, Henry spotted a staircase leading down to what looked like a cellar door. "This way," he urged, pulling Madeline toward the stairs. They were running out of time. They made their way down the stairs, stumbling in the cramped space that made it hard to move swiftly. With a swift yank, Henry threw open the cellar door, and they ducked inside, quickly slamming it shut behind them. The darkness swallowed them whole, and for a moment, the only sound was the heavy rhythm of their breathing. Madeline's heart pounded, but the brief pause gave her a chance to catch her breath. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely a murmur in the pitch-black room. Henry's eyes darted around, scanning the space for anything that might help them. The cellar was small, the ceiling low, and the shelves lined with dusty boxes and old equipment. There was only one tiny window up high, far too small and too out of reach for either of them to escape through. "We need to find another way out," Henry said quietly. Without warning, the door rattled and Madeline's stomach dropped. They had found them. "Get ready," Henry muttered, bracing himself against the door. "They'll be through any second." Panic surged through Madeline as her heart skipped a beat. There was nowhere to go, no place to hide. She grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor, her hands shaking. She wasn't a fighter, but she wouldn't let them take her without a fight. The door slammed open and the first man barged in, his eyes wide with fury. Henry swung a metal pipe he'd grabbed from the floor, landing a solid hit to the man's chest. The impact sent him flying back into the hallway. But before they could react, another man surged forward, grabbing Henry by the collar and slamming him into the wall. "Henry!" Madeline screamed, rushing toward them without thinking. She swung the broken plank at the man, landing a blow to his side. He grunted in pain, but his grip on Henry didn't falter. Instead, he shoved Henry harder into the wall, pinning him there. "Madeline, run!" Henry yelled, his voice thick with urgency. But Madeline wasn't about to leave him. She raised the plank again, ready to strike, but the man caught her arm, stopping her cold. His grip was unyielding like iron, and she cried out as he twisted her wrist, forcing the plank from her grasp. "Enough of this," the man growled, shoving both Henry and Madeline to the floor. He pulled a gun from his waistband and pointed it at Henry's chest. "Gray warned you, Whitman. You should have listened." Madeline's blood ran ice-cold as she stared at the barrel of the gun, her heart thudding painfully. "No," she cried, struggling to get back on her feet, but the other man held her back. Time seemed to freeze as the gunman raised the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Panic clawed at Madeline's mind. Was this really how it was going to end? They were so close to the truth. They couldn't go out like this. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang, and Madeline flinched, bracing for the worst. But when she opened her eyes, the gunman was staggering back, his face a mask of shock. Blood blossomed on his chest, and he crumpled to the floor. Madeline's breath hitched as she saw who had fired the shot. James stood in the doorway, the gun still smoking in his hand. The room went silent for a beat before James lowered the weapon, his face unreadable. "I told you to stay out of this, Henry," he said coolly. "But I guess I owe you one." The second man, still holding Madeline, froze, his eyes flicking between James and the gun. Without another word, he released her and bolted down the hallway. Madeline stumbled forward, her body shaking from the shock. Henry scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. "James? Why?" James shrugged, slipping the gun into his jacket. "I'm not fond of loose ends, but I'm even less fond of a mess. You two were about to make things very messy." Madeline's mind raced. "You saved us." "Don't get the wrong idea," James said, his voice sharp. "I didn't do this out of the goodness of my heart. You two are a liability, and Gray doesn't know I'm here. But you need to get out of here before anyone else shows up." Henry took a cautious step toward him. "Why are you helping us?" James's eyes narrowed. "Because I'm tired of playing this game. Henry Gray's people have grown too powerful, and I'm done sticking my neck out for them. But that doesn't mean I'm on your side. Think of this as a one-time favor." Madeline could hardly believe what she was hearing. After everything James had done, after all the lies and manipulation, he was actually saving them. "What about the files?" she asked, glancing at the folder with her mother's name written across the top. James hesitated for a moment before nodding toward the table. "Take them," he said, his voice low. "But be smart about it. Gray won't stop until you're dead. If he finds out you have those—" Henry quickly snatched the files and tucked them under his arm. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt strange, foreign even. "Don't thank me," James replied darkly. "Just disappear." Madeline and Henry exchanged a glance before they bolted for the exit. James didn't follow. Neither of them looked back. The only sound was the frantic pounding of their footsteps as they rushed through the estate, slipping through the shadows and into the night. They didn't slow down until they were far from the mansion, not daring to take a breath until it was miles behind them. For a long stretch, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily between them. Madeline stared out the window, her thoughts spinning. They had the files, but now they knew just how far Gray's influence reached. They had barely escaped with their lives, and she wasn't sure they'd be so lucky next time. Henry finally broke the silence, his voice rough. "I can't believe it." "Neither can I," Madeline said, her heart still pounding. "James? Why would he do that?" "I don't know," Henry admitted. "But whatever his reason, we owe him." Madeline shook her head. "We can't trust him. He's just as dangerous as the rest of them." "Maybe," Henry said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But for now, we've got what we came for." Madeline glanced at the files in Henry's lap. They held the answers to everything they had been searching for. But they were also the most dangerous thing they had ever touched. "What now?" she asked quietly. Henry's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Now we find out the truth, no matter what it costs." The file detailed Amelia's final days in painstaking detail. Surveillance photos, phone logs, and handwritten notes chronicling every move she made. It was as though someone had been shadowing her every step, tracking her every interaction. Madeline's voice trembled as she whispered, "This is insane. Why would anyone go this far?" Henry's face darkened. "Because she was a threat," he replied, his voice low. "Whoever's behind this wanted to keep her under control. And when that didn't work, they made sure she was eliminated." Madeline's heart twisted with every page she turned. It was a painful reminder of how her mother's life had been manipulated, controlled, and ultimately taken away. The pages were filled with notes about her mother's planned meetings, business deals she was involved in, and even references to Henry himself. It became clear now that whoever had orchestrated this had been working to keep Amelia from reconnecting with him, and from revealing the truth. Henry's hands trembled as he turned to the last few pages. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly in the notes. "Malcolm Warren." Madeline's eyes went wide. He was involved? But he said he only delivered the letter. Henry's voice went cold. Looks like he did a lot more than that. He was feeding information to someone higher up, reporting on Amelia's movements. And that's not all, there are references to payments transactions. This was a coordinated effort. Madeline's pulse quickened. So he knew all along, she said, her voice shaking with anger. He lied to us. He was working for Gray, Henry confirmed, his jaw clenched. He pulled out another sheet. Look here. Madeline leaned in, scanning the paper. It was a transaction record showing a large sum of money transferred to an account under a name she didn't recognize. But in the margin there was a hastily scribbled note. Payment for Amelia's elimination confirmed. A cold wave of horror washed over Madeline. They paid to have her killed, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Henry's eyes were dark with fury, the pain of it all evident in the lines of his face. I always suspected it, he said quietly. But seeing it here, knowing it was planned, it makes it real. Madeline clenched her fists, her anger rising. We need to find out who's behind this. If Malcolm was involved, maybe he can lead us to Gray. We have to confront him. Make him tell us the truth. Henry shook his head. I don't think he'll talk willingly. Not if he's as deep in this as the files suggest. But we can't let it go. We have to confront him. And if he refuses to cooperate, we'll find another way to make him talk. The following morning, Henry and Madeline set out to find Malcolm. They knew it was going to be risky, but they didn't have a choice. Armed with the information from the files, they tracked him to his office, an unassuming building in a quiet part of town. When they arrived, the receptionist informed them that Malcolm was in a meeting, but Henry insisted they couldn't wait. After a tense exchange, they were finally allowed through. Malcolm looked up, surprised, as they entered his office. Henry? Madeline? What are you doing here? He asked, his voice betraying his shock. We need to talk, Henry said, his tone icy. And this time we're not leaving until we get answers. Malcolm's eyes shifted nervously. I already told you everything I know, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I don't have anything more to give you. Madeline stepped forward, her eyes burning with fury. Stop lying to us, she snapped. We know you were involved. We found the files, the records, everything. You were feeding information to Gray. And you helped arrange my mother's death. Malcolm's face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, but his fear was written all over his face. Enough, Henry shouted, slamming the file onto the desk in front of him. We have proof. You can deny it all you want, but we know the truth. The only question now is whether you're going to cooperate, or if we'll have to find other ways to make you talk. Malcolm stared at the file, his hands shaking. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I was just following orders. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Then tell us who gave the orders, Henry demanded, leaning in closer. Who is Gray? Who paid you to do this? For a moment Malcolm hesitated, as though weighing his options. Then with a deep breath he finally spoke. All right, he said, his voice cracking. I'll tell you, but you have to promise me protection. If Gray finds out I talked, I'm as good as dead. We can't promise you anything, Madeline said, her voice cold. But if you tell us what we need to know, we might be able to keep you out of this mess. Malcolm swallowed hard, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Gray isn't just one person, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's an organization, a network of people who handle things quietly, efficiently. They take care of problems, and they make sure no one asks questions. Who's at the top? Henry pressed. Who runs it? Malcolm shook his head. I don't know his real name. I only ever dealt with intermediaries. But there's a man. He goes by the director. He's the one who gives the orders, the one who decides who lives and who dies. And he's very careful. No one meets him unless he wants them to. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. How do we find him? Malcolm's expression darkened with despair. You don't, he said quietly. You can't. That's the whole point. He's untouchable. The only way you'll ever get close to him is if he wants you to. But if you keep digging, he'll come after you. And when he does, you won't see it coming. Henry's eyes narrowed, full of determination. We're not backing down. We're going to find him. And we're going to make him pay for what he did. Malcolm looked at them, a mix of fear and pity in his eyes. I hope you know what you're doing, he warned. Because once you start down this path, there's no turning back. As they left the office, Madeline felt a grim sense of resolve settle over her. They had a name now, the director, and a better understanding of the organization they were up against. But the knowledge also made it clear just how deep they were in, and how high the stakes had become. What do we do now? Madeline asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Henry's jaw was set, his eyes filled with unyielding resolve. We find the director, he said. If he's the one behind all this, he's the one who needs to answer for it. And we're going to make sure he does. Madeline nodded, though a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. They were closer to the truth than ever before, but they were also closer to danger. We'll need help, she said softly. We can't do this alone. I know, Henry said, his voice steady but grim. We'll find allies. People who want to see Gray brought down as much as we do. But whatever happens, we're not stopping until we see this through. As they drove away from Malcolm's office, the city lights flickering in the distance, Madeline felt a strange mixture of hope and dread settle in her chest. They had finally pierced the veil of Gray's network, but they had also uncovered something far darker and more dangerous. And somewhere in the shadows the director was watching, waiting, ready to strike back. But Madeline refused to let fear stop her. She had come too far. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth for her mother anymore. It was for Henry, for herself, for everyone who had been manipulated and silenced by Gray's empire. The days that followed were a blur of planning, phone calls, and long nights spent poring over the documents they had taken from Amelia's estate. Every lead felt like a fragile thread, pulling them deeper into a web they didn't fully understand. They knew they were running out of time. Every minute spent searching for the director was another minute closer to him discovering their efforts, and likely sending someone to stop them. Henry reached out to his old contacts, calling in favors, leveraging information, and doing whatever he could to track down any clue that might lead them to the director. Madeline, meanwhile, continued to sift through the endless files, looking for anything that might reveal a weakness in Gray's empire. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized just how vast and complex Gray's network truly was. It wasn't just a small group of criminals. It was an empire with tendrils in everything from business to politics to law enforcement. People in power. People who could make sure the truth never saw the light of day. Then one night, as they were going through the files in Henry's office, Madeline found something that made her heart stop. It was a list of names, each one marked with a date and a code. Her fingers froze as she recognized some of the names, journalists, businessmen, even a politician or two. But it was the last name on the list that took her breath away. Amelia Porter. Next to her name was a code she didn't recognize, but it didn't matter. She knew what it meant. Henry's voice was quiet, but it cut through her thoughts. What is it? Madeline could barely bring herself to speak, her voice shaking. It's a list, she managed. I think it's a list of people they've eliminated. She forced herself to say it, even though the word felt like a knife in her chest. And my mother is on it. Henry moved closer, his eyes scanning the paper. His expression darkened as he read. They've been keeping records of everyone they've targeted, he said, his voice low, edged with disgust. This is how they operate, cataloging every person they've silenced. It's sick. Madeline's hands trembled as she turned the page, hoping it would bring some clue, some thread that could unravel the network. There was more. The next page was a series of emails, encrypted and full of coded language, but one name stood out among the messages: the director. It was clear from the tone of the emails that whoever was sending them was giving orders, coordinating activities, and managing the operations of Gray's network. We have to decode this, Madeline said, her voice urgent. This could be the key to everything. Henry's brow furrowed. If we can figure out where these emails are coming from, we might be able to trace them back to the director. Madeline nodded, but the reality of their situation was setting in. But we're going to need help. The next day they met with Alex, the journalist who had tipped them off about Gray's estate. He had agreed to help, But he had made it very clear that his involvement came at a significant risk. "If Gray finds out I'm helping you," Alex said, his voice low and serious, "I'm done for. But if we can bring this to light, it'll be worth it." "We need to decode these emails," Henry said, sliding the documents across the table. "Can you do it?" Alex looked over the papers, his eyes narrowing. "I know a guy who can," he said. "He's a tech expert and he's good at cracking this kind of encryption. But it'll take time." "Time is something we don't have much of," Madeline replied, her voice tense. "Can you do it quickly?" "I'll make sure of it," Alex promised. "But listen, if these emails lead to the director, you need to be prepared. This isn't just poking the bear anymore. You're going to war. If we bring this out, they'll come after you." Henry's eyes were resolute, filled with the weight of their mission. "We understand the risks. Just get it done." A few days later, Alex called with the news they had been hoping for but dreading at the same time. "We cracked the encryption," Alex said, his voice urgent. "And you're not going to believe this. The emails? They're coming from a private server at a mansion on the outskirts of the city. But here's the kicker. The property is listed under a corporation that belongs to your brother, Henry." Henry's blood went cold. "What?" he said, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "That's impossible. My brother would never be involved in something like this." "Are you sure about that?" Alex's voice was cautious, even concerned. "Because all the evidence points to him. The director isn't just some shadowy figure in the background. He's been right under your nose the whole time." Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Henry, her mind racing with the implications. "Henry, what if your brother is the director?" "No," Henry replied immediately, shaking his head. "There's no way. I've known him my whole life. He would never be involved in something like this." But even as the words left his mouth, doubt began to creep in. He thought about the times his brother had been distant. His secretive behavior, the unexplained absences, the sudden rise to power in the family business. Could it really be true? Could the one person he trusted most in the world have been the mastermind behind all of this? "We need to confront him," Madeline said, her voice firm, despite the fear that twisted in her gut. "If he's the director, he has to answer for what he's done. We can't let him hide behind Gray's network anymore." Henry's chest tightened at the thought. Confronting his brother meant facing a painful truth. That the person he had trusted most in the world might have betrayed him in ways he couldn't even fathom. But no matter how much it hurt, he knew what had to be done. "All right," Henry said, his voice barely steady. "But we need to be careful. If he's really behind this, he won't let us expose him without a fight." The tension between them was palpable as they drove to the mansion that night. It was a journey neither of them had anticipated. Their minds were heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. This place, the sprawling estate surrounded by tall gates and guarded by surveillance cameras, had once been familiar. But tonight it felt alien, like the lair of a stranger. As they approached the gates, Madeline felt a surge of anxiety clawing at her insides. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile silence between them. Henry's gaze was steely as he stared ahead, the mansion looming in the distance. "We go in, we confront him, and we make him talk." His words, though resolute, carried the weight of disbelief. If he's the director, then he has to explain why he did this. And if he's not, we'll find out who is. They parked the car and walked toward the entrance, their footsteps muted on the gravel driveway. Each step they took toward the front door felt like a step further into the abyss. The mansion's grandeur was stark in the moonlight, its windows dark and uninviting. Inside they knew Robert, Henry's brother, was waiting. As they entered the foyer, a chill ran down Madeline's spine. The mansion felt empty, even though they knew someone was inside. Every shadow seemed to loom larger than it should, and every sound felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were listening. They made their way to the study, where Henry's brother sat behind a large mahogany desk. Robert didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his face wore the look of surprise, then amusement. "Henry? Madeline." His voice was a mix of curiosity and disdain. "What are you doing here?" Henry's chest tightened, but his voice was cold, controlled. "We need to talk, Robert. About Gray." For a moment Robert's expression was unreadable, but then a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "So you figured it out then?" he said, leaning back in his chair with casual ease. "I was wondering how long it would take you." Madeline's heart dropped into her stomach. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath her, the world suddenly tilting in a way she hadn't been prepared for. "You're the director," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "You've been running this all along?" Robert didn't flinch. "Yes," he said, his tone calm, almost bored. "I've been managing Gray's network for years. It's quite efficient, really. We handle problems. We protect our interests and we make sure everything runs smoothly. But I never thought my own brother would be the one to try and bring me down." Henry stood frozen, his mind reeling. His voice cracked with emotion, but his words were firm. "Why, Robert? Why would you do this?" "Because it's necessary," Robert replied, his eyes turning cold. "You don't understand, Henry. This is how the world works. People like us, we don't get to where we are by playing by the rules. We make our own rules. And sometimes that means making hard decisions." Madeline stepped forward, fury flashing in her eyes. "You had Amelia killed," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You destroyed our lives." Robert's face softened, but only slightly. His tone became more quiet, almost regretful. "I didn't want to," he said, his eyes looking far away, as if remembering something painful. "But she was a risk. Henry, she was going to expose things that could have ruined everything. I tried to stop it, tried to keep her quiet, but she wouldn't listen. So I did what I had to do." Henry's world tilted dangerously as he fought to keep his composure. His throat closed as he spoke, the weight of the betrayal nearly suffocating him. "She was the woman I loved," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And you had her murdered." Robert's response was chilling in its coldness. "It was business, Henry," he said. "Nothing personal." Madeline's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. "This isn't over," she said, her voice seething with fury. "We're going to expose you, and you're going to pay for everything you've done." For the first time, Robert's smile faltered, then returned, colder than before. "I wouldn't be so sure about that," he said, rising from his chair. "You're not leaving this mansion tonight. I have people on the way, and they're going to make sure you never get the chance to tell anyone what you found out." Henry's pulse quickened, the air growing thick with tension. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a threat. It was a fight for their lives. "Run, Madeline," Henry said, grabbing her arm with urgency. "We have to get out of here." But before they could make a move, the door to the study burst open, and two armed men stepped in, blocking their only exit. Robert stood tall, his face twisted into a satisfied smirk. "It's over," he said, his voice smooth with finality. "You should have stayed out of this." Madeline's mind raced, but in the same moment, she refused to let fear control her. Acting on instinct, she grabbed a heavy vase from the desk and hurled it at one of the men. The vase shattered, distracting them for just a moment. "Go!" she shouted, her voice sharp. "Now!" They ran toward the window, smashing through the glass as the guards scrambled to react. The night air was cold and biting as they tumbled onto the grass below. "Move, Henry!" Madeline screamed, pulling him to his feet. They didn't look back as they sprinted across the lawn, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of shouts and footsteps grew louder behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They had uncovered the truth, and now they had to escape with it, no matter the cost. As they ran through the darkness, the mansion fading behind them, one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And they would stop at nothing to bring the director down.